Thank you for coming back for session 2. My name is Kath Kohler and I'm a Senior Technical Advisor with Technical and Regulation. Currently I've actually taken a position as a team leader for cladding operations. Don't hold that against me. But I'm here to present volume 2 of the NCC today. So we will be going over the key changes that we believe are important for you as a group to understand, and as Matt said, that not all the changes are being covered in this session, so please have a look yourself and familiarise yourself with the entire volume 2. So as we covered in session 1, there have been some changes in relation to the structure of the code, and it flows through to volume 2, and it's very similar to volume 1. So what we'll do is we'll just kick straight back in because I don't want to take any more time than what we need to. So as Matt showed in session 1, the structure of the code has changed. However, really the content in a lot of these changes hasn't changed or it hasn't disappeared. So for those of you who haven't had a look at the code, jump in and have a look, because I had an inquiry the other day and I went to go to the old section that I always knew where it was, and then it wasn't there, and I'm like, oh, you know, bugger, they've deleted it, but they hadn't deleted it, they've just moved it. So as you'll see on the screen, we have the structure for the 2016, and now it's our governing requirements, and now we've got the structure for the 2019. So it's very similar, well, it's exactly the same as what volume 1 has. Now, before I go on in relation to the structural liability verification method, I just wanted to highlight that the structural requirements have moved into Part 3.0, where they previously were located in Part 3.11 for structural design manuals. So it's a change. So as I said, it hasn't been deleted, it's just been moved. So we've just got to get used to where they're now located. So it's one to keep in mind. Now, V2.1.1 is the structural reliability verification method, and is used by the structural engineers as a means to verify the reliability of structural members. So it's important to note that this is only relevant when you're using the verification method as a performance solution, and it doesn't change the application of the deemed to satisfy provision. So we've had a couple of questions in relation to that, so I just wanted to clarify that from the outset. So the ABCB have conducted some technical reviews in relation to this verification method, and this has resulted in a number of changes. So the reliability indices have been increased, with the permanent actions that have been increased to 4.3, and the imposed actions have been increased to 4. So you are now able to derive the reliability index from an equivalent deemed to satisfy provision. So for example, you could derive your value from AS 3600 for the concrete structures, and this change also occurs in the verification method BV1 within volume 1. So the ABCB are updating their handbooks, and as Matt said, some are up and then some are on their way. So just keep an eye on their website and get a hold of those handbooks, because they're actually quite useful. Now, there is a new acceptable construction manual, and it's AS 4678, and it's for the design of earth retaining structures, including ground anchors. And we also have Part 3.1.2, which covers the construction requirements for earth retaining structures. Now, the standard is actually limited in scope, and it applies to walls between 800 mil and 15 metres in height, with the slopes steeper than 70 degrees to the horizontal. So you have to work within those design limitations to be able to use this provision. So this is due to the common earth pressure theories not being applicable for slopes flatter than 70 degrees to the horizontal. So there's specific range in which you need to work within. So walls outside of the scope are required to use other parts of Section 3 relating to the earth retaining structures, such as your other structural design manuals, or you can develop a performance solution for the design of your retaining structure. So the standard is actually written in a limit state format and provides your design principles to be used when designing retaining structures, including the different limit state modes required for considerations such as your rotation. So structural components of a wall construction will still need to be designed using the relevant material codes, so your 3700 and your 3600. So you still have to use other standards in conjunction with this part. Drainage is probably the most important aspect in relation to the design of earth retaining structures that need to be considered. And it's important that the drainage system are carefully designed and specified. Now, the standard requires that the consideration be considered for the effects of water seepage, hydrostatic pressure in the design of these structures. And it's very important that the design of the wall considered the operational of the subsoil surface drainage system and what's actually produced on site specific, so it's produced for a site specific design. So this means that when the designer determines that a drainage system is required, they actually must design the drainage system. So this is very important for building surveyors to keep in mind, that when they have a design for a retaining structure and that design identifies that it requires a drainage system, that designer responsible for that design provides the drainage system requirements. So that's just one to keep in the front of your mind. There's also been changes to using AS 3700, so part 3.3.2 for reinforced masonry, and the acceptable construction manual where additional requirements apply to the reinforced masonry member. So currently where you have a reinforced masonry member and you don't achieve the minimum amount of reinforcement required, you're required to design the member as an unenforced masonry member. So that's within 2016. So now the code requires the consideration of additional clauses in AS 3700 relating to the height limitations using AS 1170 Part 4 and the capacity reduction factors for grouted unreinforced masonry to be used in the computations. So that's also something to keep in mind for the designers in the room, engineers in the room, and also the building surveyors to ensure that these new requirements are actually being applied. So the same criteria applies when you're using the acceptable construction manual for isolated masonry piers, and you may also be required to consider other parts of AS 3700. So once again, it's imperative that you keep these changes in the front of your mind when you're checking documents to ensure that the current requirements are being used. So this is a good one for the justification as to why high-waisted acid wash jeans are back in fashion. What was old is new again. So all the young ones are wearing the high-waisted hip jeans, and we've now introduced part 335. That was a joke for those who I got to. That's it. So part 335 for masonry veneer. You will note that this was previously contained or was similar in BCA 2011. For those of us who have been around long enough to remember BCA 2011, you're all young, so you probably don't. So the first thing to note with the introduction of part 335 is that the acceptable construction practice contains limitations with its use. So this includes that the site not having a wind speed of more than an N3, the height of the veneer not exceeding 8.5 metres, and it being constructed on footings complying with part 3.2. So you need to meet those limitations or those requirements to be able to use these deemed to satisfy provisions. It's also important that it can only be used for Class A, S and M sites. So there's likely to be a variety of areas within Victoria where you can't use these deemed to satisfy provisions. And in these circumstances, you'll still have the ability to use other acceptable construction manuals or to develop a performance solution. So the acceptable construction practice provides provisions for your weatherproofing elements such as your cavities, damp-proof course, flashing weep holes, and built-in components such as your wall ties and your lintels. And there are requirements for vertical articulation joints, and these requirements include where they must be located, not less than 10 mil in width, and that the articulation joints must be filled with either your compressed foam and flexibly sealed, or a backer rod and flexibly sealed, as shown on the diagram on the screen. So the BCA now provides for 3 options for designing the veneer, and you can utilise the various methods in relation to the design of your masonry veneer now, just keeping in mind that you've got the limitations when applying the deemed to satisfy provisions. So there's also been a new acceptable construction practice for your isolated masonry piers that was introduced as of the 1st of May, and it's part 336, so for your isolated masonry piers. And the acceptable construction practice provides you provisions for piers supporting a roof structure forming part of the main roof, or attached to a wall of a Class 1 building and a freestanding carport. So there are the limitations where this can be applied. And AS 4773 series only contains the requirements for subfloor piers, meaning isolated piers included in this acceptable construction practice would need to be designed using AS 3700 for your masonry structures. So like the masonry veneer acceptable construction practices, it contains limitations with its use, and includes, once again, the site not having a design wind speed of more than an N3, the height of the piers not exceeding 2.7 metres in height, and the building not being constructed in an alpine area. So you need to sit within those limitations to be able to use this acceptable construction practice. There are specific tie-down details depending on whether the piers support a tiled or a sheet roof, so that's something to keep in mind when you see any isolated piers, any designs that come across your desk. And as mentioned, when discussing the reinforced masonry, if you're using AS 3700 as the acceptable construction manual, there will be other design requirements to be considered. So you just need to keep that in mind when using these forms. So part 3.4 covers framing, and in the NCC 2016 version, there was no distinction between the timber used above or below ground in the provisions for the subfloor ventilation. So in the 2019 version of the code, they've distinguished between these requirements for the different levels of preservative treatment. So with your H3 is required above ground, and your H5 required in ground. So they've just provided us with some extra information. So this change also occurs in volume 1 under F1.12. So the acceptable construction practice for steel framing has been removed, and the only deemed to satisfy options for your steel framing are the acceptable construction manuals. So it was found that the acceptable construction manuals are more contemporary, and the acceptable construction practice was not being utilised, so hence its removal. And this was all part of the ABCB's work in making it a more readable, a useful document for the industry. The acceptable construction manuals have also been expanded for timber framing to include AS 1720 Part 5 for the design of nail-plated timber roof trusses, AS 1720 Part 1 for the design of timber structures, and AS 1860 Part 2 for the installation of particle floorboarding. So they were always referenced as a primary reference standards, and in Part 311 for AS 1720 Part 1, however, they've been included in the primary reference documents. So you will notice that there are a number of primary reference documents now that were secondary reference documents previously, and they've just been bumped up in the order. So just keep that also in mind. So one of the really good changes, and Matt and I, when we were putting the presentation together, were talking about what our favourite ones were, and his one was the fire thing, because he worked in the fire services. I haven't worked in the fire services. So I've sat next to plumbers for the last couple of years, so roofing's my thing at the moment. So part 3.5.1 used to be in the 2016 NCC was like a single clause for metal roofing, and the requirements now have been expanded. So you now have a series of clauses that cover the specific requirements. And it covers your material compatibility, your roof pitches, your fixings, installation sequences, flashings and cappings. So this all goes to the readability and usability of the NCC. And so it actually makes it a much more user-friendly document. The roof tiles and shingles, they've been separated, and the requirements have been detailed and set out to improve the readability once again and reflect improved construction methods. The flashing details for tiled roofs have been expanded significantly to provide details of wall and step flashings and flashings for penetrations. So the figure up on the screen shows the acceptable flashing configurations that have been included in the provisions. So there is some guidance for the acceptable requirements, including the flashing abutting the masonry walls and the framed clad walls. There are some new discharge requirements for eaves and gutters for tiled roofs, and it now specifies that tiles must overhang the fascia or the tiling batten by not less than 35 mil, which is shown on the screen. So part 3.5.3 covers your gutters and downpipes. So Victoria has varied out of the acceptable construction practice in part 3.5.3, and you'll only now be able to use AS/NZS 3500 Part 3 under the deemed to satisfy provision, and that's because we just do it better in Victoria to any other state. Sorry for the gentleman from Sydney. So the reason, actually, it's not just because we're really good, it's because this variation is in the Plumbing Code of Australia, and it removes the acceptable construction practice of Part 3.53 and only permits the use of 3500 Part 3 for compliance. The VBA has previously provided advice in relation to the discrepancy between the BCA and the PCA and suggested that compliance with AS 3500 Part 3 should be used. So there were situations where downpipes were servicing more than 12 metres of gutter length, and the building surveyors were suggesting this was non-compliant when it actually complied with the Australian standard. So it's just another thing to note that there's been a good change and that we're working in making sure that we're limiting some of the things that clash within the code. Also to note, relating to drainage, is that nationally, Section 5 of AS 3500 Part 5 has been removed as an acceptable construction manual as of the 2019, so that can no longer be used. So clause 3546 covers the flashing to wall openings. So the requirements have been expanded and clarified. So inadequate flashing has been a subject of many disputes, and within Tech and Reg we got a number of calls in relation to defective building work and complaints from consumers. And this was always an issue where we had a clause within the code that was potentially can be considered ambiguous, or it didn't have enough information. So we're hoping that this new provision should assist practitioners in preventing water penetration and reducing the complaints. So it now clarifies that flashing is to be provided to the bottom, top and sides of openings. However, head flashing can be omitted in certain circumstances. So the head flashing may be omitted if it is protected by the eave with a width of more than 3 times the height of the cladding above the opening, as per the figure up on the screen. So it's very easy, it's very simple to follow, so it should be something that we should all be able to comply with. And the provisions also outline requirements for joins in the flashing, including the overlap and fastening requirements. So this is a really good change, and hopefully it'll reduce the complaints that are received in relation to water leakage. Now this would be one of my favourite changes. And it's probably because being within the cladding area for the last 4 months is that our inspectors go out and we need to ID the type of cladding on the buildings. And the easiest way to do that is to get down on your hands and knees and dig into the garden bed, and you'll be able to find the end of the boarding, or especially when we're trying to ID fibre cement sheet, it's really easy. And if you want a sample, if it's been sitting in the garden bed for a while, it breaks off quite easily. So clause 3547 now deals with the clearance between the cladding and the ground. So the new provision has been included so that the clearance between the bottom of the wall cladding and the adjoining finished ground level. And it's very similar to the requirements in relation to your slab. So it's similar to your wall flashings. It often required practitioners to find out what the manufacturer's requirements were. Sometimes it was ambiguous, sometimes there wasn't anything, and complaints would be received because their boarding of the walling of the system would start to rot or deteriorate, and then it became a bit of a tug of war as to whose fault it was. So your commonly used external claddings require a minimum clearance of 150 mil to the finished ground on the exterior of the building. So there's 3 key dimensions, just like the slab clearances. So depending on the ground surrounding conditions, you've got your 50 mil, 100 mil and 150. So these are similar. So the slab on ground is under part 3.1, so they're consistent in their measurements. So it will make everyone's life a lot easier. However, there is a variation, and if you have a suspended floor framing, in addition to your ground clearance, there are also requirements to extend the cladding a minimum of 50 mil below the bearers or the lowest horizontal parts of suspended floor as well, so that's an additional requirement. What I've been saying is, when I've been doing these presentations, that it's important for the builders to understand that this information should be passed on to the building owners as information as to how to maintain their houses. In some instances, the finished ground surface around the dwelling is not done when you hand over to the owner. So you may be compliant at the time you hand over, but they will either put a garden bed in, they will do paving, and so on. So that information, if it's clearly passed on to the building owner, down the track, if there is a complaint made and there is an accusation that you haven't built the house in accordance with the requirements, then you will have evidence that you've provided that information to the building owner. So just something to keep in mind, and maybe something that you put in your information pack to your owners. So there's 4 new verification methods that can be used to verify the protection of spread of fire. So the first 2 of the verification methods can be used to verify that a Class 1 building is protected from the spread of fire from another building other than an associated Class 10 or an allotment boundary. So for these verification methods, the external wall and any openings within that wall within 1.8 metres of another building or within 900 mil of the allotment boundary must be capable of withstanding a certain heat flux for 60 minutes. The external wall must extend to the underside of a non-combustible roof covering or a non-combustible eave lining. So they're the requirements or the limitations in using those verification method. So this is prescriptive, and so you must comply with those requirements to be able to use that verification method. The other 2 verification methods are used to verify that a Class 10 building does not increase the risk of spread of fire between Class 2 to 9 buildings. And so these are equivalent to CV1 and CV2 located in Volume 1, and there is guidance for these, and that can be found in the guide to Volume 1 as well. So Part 3.7 fire safety has been rejigged. So once again, nothing has actually been deleted. It's just been rearranged and probably put in a more logical sequence, and then some things have been moved out and put in more logical places. So what you'll see that we show the 2016 Part 3.7, and then you'll see the 2019 list. And as you'll see, the alpine and bushfire requirements have been moved out of Part 3.7, and now they have been relocated to Part 310, which is your ancillary provisions and additional construction requirements. And also heating appliances has also been put into Part 310. So something to remember, it hasn't been deleted, it's just been moved around a bit. Now this is my favourite, well actually no, not my favourite, the favourite one's the next one. So clause 3724 has actually been amended, and the photo actually up on the screen was provided by one of our proactive inspectors a while ago, when there was a bit of to and fro in relation to whether or not the circumstance shown in the photo was compliant. So the issue was that the BCA always required your external wall to extend to the underside of a non-combustible roof covering or eaves lining. But more commonly, you've got our garage walls or external walls on the boundary in these estates where they pretty much go wall to wall. You can stick your hand out the window and shake your neighbour's hand, you're that close. And so then they were looking at what are they going to do with the gutters. So more commonly, they were sticking the gutters at the top of the wall. So previously, if you had this situation, it would have required either a modification through the Building Appeals Board or a performance solution. So the VBA did produce some guidance to industry on this matter, I think it was last year, and it indicated that an excessive gap was non-compliant with a deemed to satisfy perspective. What one man's excessive gap is another man's not excessive gap, so there was some ambiguity. So now the code actually has the new provision, and it allows the distance for the termination of the external wall where it may terminate not more than 200 mil from the underside of a non-combustible roof covering. And in order to comply with this, the area must be sealed with a non-combustible fascia, gutter or flashing. This is my favourite change within Volume 2, and it's Clause 3725. You've got a joke, this is a very dry subject, sorry guys. So it relates to Class 10A buildings, and so what you'll note is that previously it always had the garage sitting alongside the house, and there was a clear distance on either side, and if you didn't have the clear distance, then you required your fire-rated wall. There has been additional figures with explanatory information that have been added to the Class 10A buildings section where they're adjacent to a Class 1. So now, and normally at this point, I actually walk up to the screen and I tap the screen and talk, but I can't reach. And Matt wasn't into letting me sit on his shoulders, so I'll just have to stand afar and point, and hopefully you'll get my directions. So now where you have a Class 10A attached to a Class 1 building, and the wall of the Class 10 is within 900 of the boundary, it will require to be fire rated. So it is a different configuration that now triggers the requirement for the fire rated wall. Likewise, we've had questions in previous seminars about what happens if the garage is sitting aligned with the house and the corners and corners are just attached. Same applies, it actually hasn't changed. It's your measurements, it's your 90 degrees within that triggers the requirement for the fire rating, but they've just provided some additional clarification and explanation, and they've provided this diagram within that requirement. So just one to keep in the front of the mind, because it's not a configuration that's probably ever triggered this before, so we've just got to get a little bit used to the changes, but that's one of my favourite ones. My next favourite one is in relation to Clause 3735, which is your horizontal projections. So it's becoming more and more common for your Class 1 building that incorporates a cantilevered floor, as shown in the picture on the screen. So in the 2016 NCC, in the deemed to satisfy provisions, would require a separating wall to commence from the footings or the ground slabs. So in a cantilevered situation where two Class 1 buildings are required separation, this couldn't be achieved without a performance solution or going down the modification path. So there's now a new deemed to satisfy provisions to provide a new part to deal with the horizontal projections filling in that gap. So once again, it's part of that project where the ABCB have looked at common performance solutions and seen whether or not they can adopt that into the code, and they've done that in this instance. So the provisions require that the projection within 1.8 metres of the separating wall And there are a few options for compliance. So what you need is that you need that protected. So on either side of the wall separating the class 1s, you need 1.8 metres of protection. So the protection, you've got three elements. Sorry, I digress. Three elements. So a floor or ceiling, or a floor or soffit system incorporating ceiling or soffit with a resistance of the incipient spread of fire. Or you can have your fire resistance level, so your FRL of not less than 30, 30, 30 from the underside. Or you can have a fire protective covering on the underside of the floor if the floor is combustible or metal. So the fire protective covering is a defined term, and it can include a 13mm fire protective grade plasterboard or a 12mm cement sheeting. So once again, we ripped off a really good diagram from the ABCB's presentation, and it shows you a dividing wall, and you've got the cantilevered floor. So the yellow sections on the picture are the areas that are within 1.8 metres of the horizontal protection. And once again, the ceiling with a resistance of an incipient spread of 60 minutes, or an FRL of 30, 30, 30, or your fire protective covering on the underside of the floor. So once again, your fire protective covering can be your 13mm fire protective grade plasterboard or your 12mm cement sheeting. Also to keep in mind that in addition to ensuring that the horizontal projection complies, that any surface penetrations must not reduce the fire performance of the floor or the covering. So we do have a new verification method that can be used to verify the height of the room or a space. So that's V2.4.2. So these contained some new defined terms for activity support level, activity traits, and occupant traits. So the verification method requires the consideration of your occupant characteristics, the activity characteristics, through these defined terms. So it may be determined that the height of a room is suitable after analysing each of the criteria. So for example, if you've got a class 1 building and you may have like an attic space and you've got a sloping roof and you've got a window and they put like a seated area, so it's like these retreats and quiet areas that none of us mothers ever get, but it's nice to dream about every time you walk past it. It's got the reduced height. So what you'd be looking at is the occupant characteristics, the activity characteristics for that area, and you would be determining if that's appropriate. Once again, it's analysing the criteria and considering the space and what that space is going to be used for to determine whether or not you can permit that lower height. This verification method is also used in Volume 1. However, Victoria has varied. So we have varied out in relation to FP 3.1, so it can only be used for the height component, not the space component. Just a quick word in relation to clause 3.8.1.2, so it's your wet areas. So wall to floor junctions in laundries and water closets are no longer required to be waterproof, and this aligns with the requirements of AS 3740 for your waterproofing of wet areas. So the same changes also occurred within Volume 1. And in AS 3740, a bead of sealant in a water-resistant junction, a bead of sealant is a water-resistant junction where non-water resistant and water-resistant surfaces meet. So this is one to keep in mind. So we have, in the 2019 NCC, we've got the introduction of the provisions to deal with condensation in Class 1 buildings. So like in Volume 1, it has also been introduced into Volume 2. So we touched on it in the first session, and it covered Class 2 buildings and Class 4 parts of buildings. However, there are actually some minor differences in relation to Class 1 buildings. So the provisions look at controlling your condensation by pliable building membranes and ventilation. So if you use a pliable building membrane or sarking, it needs to be on the outside of the insulation and classed as a water barrier when tested to AS 4201 Part 4, which is your pliable building membranes and underlay. In addition, it needs to be a vapour permeable in climate zones 6, 7 and 8, and they sit within Victoria. So if a pliable building membrane is not provided, like what Matt said in session 1, you need a drained cavity. It's also to note that if you do go down the drained cavity option, however, you still are putting in a building membrane, it needs to be the pliable building membrane and it needs to comply with the standard. So you can put it in on its own, or you can have your drained cavity. However, if you have your drained cavity and also you are putting in your building membrane, it still must comply. So this part also looks at your ventilation and when this is provided, and you need to achieve certain flow rates and discharge requirements. So the ventilation requirements apply to your bathrooms, sanitary compartments, laundries and kitchens, and your flow rates are 25 litres a second or 40 litres a second depending on the room. And from what we understand is that a lot of the ceiling exhaust fans and so forth that you can purchase from the hardware stores and so forth actually meet those rates quite easily. So you are able to discharge directly to the outside in all cases, and you must, however, you're not permitted to discharge into a tiled roof without sarking. And if you are permitted to discharge into the roof space, you must provide openings as detailed in the provisions. So you may require to have whirlybirds or vented eaves or so forth, depending on the space, and it'll depend on how many you have. So the method of discharge is not actually specified in a kitchen, meaning you're still able to use your recirculating range hood as long as it achieves the required flow rate. Now, it's always a contentious issue when I get to this part and say that it is very important for the designers, architects within the room to actually specify the products that you're wanting installed in the building, so that then the building surveyor can actually check to make sure that they're compliant. So if you're providing a membrane or so forth, you need to provide those test certificates. This information needs to be on the documentation because the building surveyor needs to determine compliance before issuing that building permit. You need to provide the exhaust fan information, and then that information then goes to the builder, and the builder needs to ensure that they build to those requirements that have been approved under the building permit. And then if the builder is going to vary the products of what's going to be installed for whatever reason, that needs to go back to the building surveyor before it gets done, so the building surveyor can ensure that they meet compliance if you vary out or change products. So just something to keep in mind. So clause 3927 looks at the protection of opening of windows other than bedrooms. So previously the code required the protection of openings for bedroom windows where the floor below is 2 metres or more. So that's to cover the kids that jump on their beds when they're not jumping on your furniture and happen the bed's next to the window and they fall out the window. So this now has been expanded, and the protection is required for openable windows in rooms other than bedrooms where the floor is 4 metres or more. The openable part of a window is required to be protected by a barrier with a height of not less than 865 mil, and the barrier must achieve certain requirements. So it's exactly like what the requirements were for the bedroom windows. It is now applied to other rooms where the floor is 4 metres above the external ground surface. Also, where you have a fixed part of the glazing component where the height is 865 mil or higher, then this could form part of the barrier as well. So AS 3959 relates to the construction of buildings in bushfire-prone areas. So the 2018 version of 3959 has been referenced now. So the site assessments have been amended, resulting in some changes to the exclusion of low-threat vegetation. In the 2009 edition, it provided examples of low-threat vegetation, and the 2019 version states that it relates to flammability, moisture content and fuel load. Some argue that the changes or the new standard make it a lot easier. I didn't find that, but then that just might relate to myself, but it's worth having a look at, because the changes will actually affect how you do those assessments in relation to your vegetation. Where your slopes vary, but they fall within the specified range given by the standard, it clarifies that there's no need to take separate assessments. So there is an exemption to this, and where the slopes vary over 2 or more ranges, it clarifies that that they do actually have to do your separate assessments, but that's only where it goes over 2 or more of those ranges. There's a concession that allows the reduction in construction requirements for the elevation where it's shielded by another part of the building. So there has been actually a clarification in relation to this part of the standard, and that's because people were applying it not just to the wall, they were also applying it to the subfloor and the roof, and that wasn't the intent of that concession. It only ever applied to the wall. So they've actually provided some clarification in relation to that application. There's also been a change in relation, or a concession, that now allows for your transparent or translucent roofing. So there's been a change in relation to Bell 12.5 and 12.19, that you can have your translucent or your transparent roof coverings in lieu of non-combustible roof covering. So as you'll remember, once before you couldn't have those roof coverings in those areas. You can actually now, and the example on the screen shows that as long as that roof that is containing that, so your veranda or your carport, they can have those materials as long as it's actually separated from the main part of the building. So therefore the external wall of the dwelling must extend to the underside of a non-combustible roof, and then the structure, say for example your veranda, can then join into that wall, but you must have that separation as per that example. The standard also has an example where the veranda or carport's actually lower down on the wall, and making sure that you do have that separation between those buildings so you don't have that spread of fire. There has been some changes in relation to Part 310.4, which is the construction of your alpine areas. So as I said earlier, it was actually contained within Part 3.7, so the fire safety requirements within the 2016 NCC, is now just being moved to Part 3.10, so that's the additional construction requirements. So the requirements for the external doors have been amended, and you are now permitted to include a sliding door, when previously you could only have a door that opened inwards. There's also new requirements for the threshold for not less than 900 mil above the adjacent surface, which is to ensure that your snow build-up won't prevent the door from opening. The signage requirements have also been amended to apply to only Class 1B buildings, where previously it applied to any Class 1 building, so that's a good change and clarification. The requirements regarding external trafficable surfaces has been rewritten, and the floor surface must consist of your expanded mesh if it's used as a means of egress. And once again, it's to get that snowfall through so it doesn't impede egress of the occupants. Stairs going and rising dimensions have been included, and these may be used instead of those specified under Part 3.9, because when you're in your snow boots and stuff like that, they're a lot more clunkier and so forth, and you have more trouble on a normal stair dimension, so they've allowed for differing stair dimensions. Sorry, not stair dimensions. Another change is that the clear space provisions, so up on the screen's the example, the clear space provisions around the buildings, they have been amended, and the distance between the wing and the embankment has actually decreased from 6 metres to 4 metres. So it's important to note that these changes are also in volume 1 of the NCC as well. So there has been a change that everyone gets asked around decks and whether or not there's specific requirements for decks and balconies. They have now included specific requirements or construction requirements for attachments of decks and balconies. So it falls under Part 310.6. So this is a new acceptable construction practice for attaching your decks and balconies to external wall of a Class 1 building. So one of the most important things about the acceptable construction practice is that it only applies to your timber-framed, steel-framed or core-filled concrete masonry external walls. So more than likely it means that it won't be widely used in Victoria because we use a lot of masonry veneer construction. So AS 1684, so your residential timber framing construction does not provide the details for your wailing plates, and this situation would have required the design in accordance with Part 311 under the 2016 BCA. So typically it would have been produced by an engineer. There are other limitations in using the acceptable construction practice, which includes that the height is not more than 3 metres with imposed load restrictions of 2 kPa, which is your typical normal domestic activities. So it's an important consideration when designing to determine whether or not the owner is intending on putting gym equipment, the outdoor kitchen, a spa and so forth. So if they're loading up the deck, then it may mean that they may actually exceed the 2 kPa, and then it would be out of the scope of the acceptable construction practice and you wouldn't be able to use it. The acceptable construction practice also provides details for how to attach to the external wall. So this includes your fixing details, details on junctions between your walling plates and the wall and so forth. So using Part 312, so there has been some changes and it's just an increasing stringency to improve the energy efficiency. So as briefly mentioned earlier, the energy provisions in Volume 2 have that 12-month transition adoption. So as of the 1st of May this year until the 1st of May 2020, you could use either Part 2.6 or Part 312 from either your NCC 2016 or your NCC 2019. But as of the 1st of May 2020, you will only be able to use Part 2.6 or 312 of BCA 2019. So I'll just go over a couple of the changes. So there are some amendments to the energy efficiency verification method for using a reference building. So they are now required to use a calculation method that complies with the specified standard. So you're able to use the house energy rating software as a verification method provides a limitation. So some may remember that in 2017, the CSIRO, they issued an alert advising that the HERS tools were not suitable for the purpose of that or this verification method. So using the verification method, the proposed building is required to meet certain elemental provisions. For example, your thermal insulation, the thermal breaks, the compensating for a loss of ceiling insulation. So this is similar to a building using the energy rating options where certain elemental provisions are required to be met. Also, the heating and cooling loads for reference buildings must now be completed using the modelling criteria that the verification method specifies. So, and this relates to your roof pitch, your ceiling height, the external wall construction, the ground floor construction are unable to be changed within, when you're using the verification method. So there's prescriptive requirements within the verification method for you to be able to use it. And so this differs from the previous verification method where no criteria was specified. And not that there'd be anyone in the room, but what was happening, or what was found to be happening, was that the modelling building probably wasn't up to scratch, and so therefore it was making it easier for the proposed building to achieve the requirements. So now they've set some limitations in place that you must achieve for that modelling building to ensure that you're actually doing it appropriately. So the overall idea of the verification method is the same. It's just that there's some variances in the criteria for the reference building and the requirements for the calculation method required to be used. So as Matt indicated in relation to when he was doing session 1, is that there are some changes in relation to your heating and cooling load limits that apply to your NatHERS compliance pathway for a Class 1 building. So the current code requires you to achieve a NatHERS 6-star rating. So in 2019, the NatHERS compliance pathway now requires you to also separate your heating and cooling loads limits that correspond with the star rating specified in the ABCB standard for the NatHERS heating and cooling load limits. So on the screen, you'll see an excerpt from the table from that standard, and that applies to a Class 1 building with concrete slab on ground construction. So if we consider the NatHERS Climate Zone 66, which is for Ballarat, we can see that our Class 1 building is not allowed to exceed load limits specified. So what you'll note if you have a look is that some areas will have a way higher heating load limit than what the cooling will be. Or vice versa, you'll have a higher cooling load limit to what you will heating. And it all depends on where you're actually located and what your climate is as to what your heating and cooled load limits are. So that's one also to keep in mind, and one that you'll need to use. Also, what Matt pointed out is that you will, the certificates have always been producing the heating and cooling limits. So they're on the certificate, so it'll just be a matter of the building surveyor checking those against the standard to make sure that you're within those requirements. So there have been some other changes to Part 312. So now we have some changes in relation to the clarification that's been provided when dealing with roof lights, that they should be actually sealed regardless of which room they serve in climate zones 4 to 8, so that's within Victoria. Sealing to restrict your air infiltration is now required to a door between a Class 1 building and an unconditioned Class 10 part of the building. So your man door, if it's internal to the house, it now requires to be sealed to restrict the air infiltration. Previously, the provisions referred to the external doors, and now it includes that internal door between the Class 1 and unconditioned Class 10 building. Another change is that the ceilings have been added to the list of elements required to be constructed with a minimum or to minimise air leakage. Previously, this only applied to walls and floors and openings, such as your windows and door frames, when they form part of the external facade. So that's also one to keep in mind.